Hi everybody, this is Steve with a Mirror Maze tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how to construct an electric rainbow. Basically the concept came from, how do I create an accordion-like structure that can expand and collapse pretty freely without too much work once it's built, but also not that much work to even construct. So that was kind of the big question, and then I got working on it, and it sort of evolved into this arc. First, it was a jelly arc, which I created, which you have the outer kind of translucent, transparent texture, and then on the inside, it's more of like a kind of like a glitter jelly-like, almost like a toy of some sort, but it also has kind of a human quality. It looks kind of like a blood vessels or a vein. So it's pretty interesting. But when I was building this, I was like, well, how do I, change the color of each individual one? Turns out it was sometimes you have to do things manually. So I did have to create another setup where I basically have individual clones and just color them accordingly. And that's just how it had to work out for this situation. But I figured I would jump in and show you how to take that approach. That way you can see the process. And then you'll be able to create this version or that version, or anything in between, or expand upon it. So let's just go ahead and get started. And we're going to build our base first. So what we're going to do is create a cylinder, and this could be really any shape. But I chose a cylinder. I just wanted something very minimal. And let's just make that a little bit bigger, and we're going to add a fillet and just make it just big enough so that we catch some light on this outer edge. So once we light this thing, we will just catch a little bit of specular highlights around here, which will be nice. And let's just add some rotation segments so it's smooth, and just render that, preview. And now we're going to go ahead and stick it inside of a cloner. So this is going to be our basic structure here, and I'm doing a count of 5 because that's how I set my rainbow up. It worked great that way, so I'm going to preview with you guys, do it this way. You could obviously use as many as you want. You need a minimum of 3 just so you can have your 2 bottom points and then your middle point for the arc, which if you have less, it will create more of an even look. And if the more you add, you can have more of a varied look because you can control those individual clones to have a rotation and position of their own. So that way you get more of the structure that I set up. So you can see that there's a little bit of kind of a kink variation and just a little bit more of an organic look to it. So let's set it up that way and move forward from there. So we have our clones, and I guess this would be a good point to do a MoGraph selection, and we're just going to select the middle 3 because eventually we're going to want to hide those, or we can actually just hide them right now. So we have our MoGraph selection, and we have our cloner selected. And if we go to our effectors and just choose a plane effector, let's title that, or I was going to say visibility. Hide's much shorter. Let's use hide and deselect position. So to hide those, you just choose a uniform scale and just scale it back to -1. So basically it doesn't exist. So once we have that, those are hidden. Now we just have our cloner, and we're going to adjust the spacing in just a minute. Actually, let's just adjust it now. Bring it down to almost 0. So they're slightly touching. I mean, you could bring it down as far as you want, but I left a little bit of space in there for mine just because all of that rainbow is going to take up quite a bit of room. So we wanted to show some volume in there. But I mean, that thing could be totally recessed into one of these. It all depends on how you want it to look. So let's go ahead and add the Step Effector. And that is going to be controlling our position. I accidentally made that apparent. I don't want to do that. Unselect scale, and let's adjust the position just so that it will move up a little bit. So right now our fall off is set to infinite. We actually want it to be linear so that we have pretty easy control over it. All we'll have to do is move this up and down to basically control the Y position. So it's pretty intuitive setup there. So there we go. We have the Y position. So this is essentially the basic structure. Let's go ahead and get our spline work created. So we're basically just going to create some abstract circles, or not abstract, kind of an abstract pattern comprised of circles. So let's just create one and change the orientation to X, Z, and hit T to scale. We'll just bring that down. So now let's just head over into the top view, which on my keypad is F2. And let's just hide those deformers for now so that we can clearly see what we're doing. So now we're in the top view, and we can easily place our circle pattern within the confines of our bigger object here, our base. So if we go ahead and duplicate those, you can either control drag on the object itself or in the object panel over here. And we'll just vary the size a little bit. And we're going for Roy G. Biv here. So that is 7 different colors. All of the wonderful colors. It can be any color you want, but yeah, so we'll just space these out. Have a few small ones, a few larger ones. Once we get these going here, we can there. That is 7. And scale that down. Let's just I want to solo these, just make sure they're all in the same Y position. I don't know if I accidentally moved anything. Just double check. Okay, yeah, sometimes things like to get moved around. All right, so those are looking pretty good. This one may be a little bit smaller just because it looks like the other ones. Move it out here, so vary it up just a little bit more. That's looking too original. There we go. Make it look a little more unique. All right. Anyway, so there we go. We have those created. What we're going to do next is select all of them, and we're going to hit C to make them editable, and that will give us the flexibility now to connect these and delete them, and they will just become one piece of spline work. If we didn't make them editable, then they would have just become a solid polygon. So it's important to take that step. So now we're just going to duplicate this cloner. Yes, we'll duplicate this cloner. We'll remove the cylinder from it and add our spline work. And we can get rid of this MoGraph selection. And we don't want to fix the clone. We want these to stay at the position that they're at. So now, let's see, we have, I'll just call this fill, and these are the caps. There. So now the effectors that we have applied to our fill, we do not want the hide because we want to see the entire fill, but we do want the step. That way we can watch them. You can see them fill up in between here. So next, basically to get our fill, we're going to add a loft. So if you select your cloner, you can then go into your panel here and option select that so that everything becomes a child of it. And there you go. So it's basically your rainbow-like structure created pretty easily. And now you can see how flexible this can be. So this is just a simple Y movement. But once we get into this a little further, you'll be able to see that you can really change the position and orientation of this pretty freely to get the results that you want. And then, of course, once we add the delay effector to it, it's going to give this thing a little bit of life so that it's moving around and appears to be a little more dynamic. And now I know there are probably lots of other ways to do this with dynamic splines, and I don't know if it would actually be possible with the tracer to have this kind of flexibility. I don't think so. I believe I did a few tests of that early on, but you know, there may be a few other methods. So let's just okay. So from here, we're going to go ahead and move this thing over so that we can see it arc. So to do that, we're going to change the X position. We're going to add an X value into the first step effector that we have, just so it moves over. And I mean, at this point, that's a pretty good amount. And we also want to rotate it, have it rotate 180 degrees so that when we add our next effector, it will actually spin around toward the ground. So we're going to just duplicate our first step effector and apply that to each cloner. So make sure that that gets dragged in there. And we're going to bring it up and rotate it negative 90 degrees. So then when this step effector drives this over, it will, once it gets into this region, it will start controlling it. So you can see it still has some settings that shouldn't be applied to it, but you can also see that this is pretty powerful setup. You can really place these effectors everywhere and have them work in concert with each other to drive your animation. So this second step, we're just going to change some of these parameters. We don't need to adjust the X value, and we don't need to adjust the rotation. We are only concerned with the Y value because we want to get this thing back down to the ground. So let's make sure our first step is all the way up. And let's go into front view. And now you can see that we're able to adjust this pretty freely. But we need to get it to arc a little bit more. So what's going on here? I think that maybe the Step Effector, the transform space right now is attached to the node, but if we change it to the object, you can see that it's now affecting the transform position is changing. So first it was affecting from the node itself, but now it is being controlled at the point of the object. So now that we have the arc-like shape formed, it's pretty good. Looks pretty decent. So now let's just play with our first step, and you can see that it's pretty good little setup. So there are a few things like when this kind of dips below, but we'll handle that a little bit later with dynamics, and it should just bounce right off the ground surface that we place. So that is pretty good. I think now we should get into creating the variation within these. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to keep really good track of our stuff. But let's make 7 of these. I just made a huge amount. So we have 7 here. So we're going to just solo each one of these and pay very close. Let's just solo the spline work and pay attention to which ones we're keeping and which ones we're getting rid of. But before we do that, let's just delete these. I wanted to, we want to actually center the access point for these, this spline work. Just at least in my example that I created, that allowed me to rotate around the center and just create a little bit of back and forth movement, which helped create the kinks in that spline work. But I mean, you could totally not do it that way and just move them manually yourself, but this just helped keep it a little bit more organized. So now that you selected your axis center and changed that to the middle, let's unsolo that, and we can make our duplicates 6, 7. So we have 7 now. So that is as many equal to the amount of circles that we have. If we just switch to our top view with F2, so we're going to want to keep track of which ones we're keeping and which ones we're getting rid of. So let's just move clockwise and then toward the middle, just to stay organized here. So for this first circle, we want to keep this, so we're going to select it, And then if you hit UI, that will invert your selection. And you can see right here when you hit the U key, it will bring up this menu. And then I is for invert. So you can invert that and hit delete. So there is our first one. And then we just want to go through and do the same thing for each. So we already did the first one. Now let's move to our second. Select our second, UI to invert, and delete the rest. And same thing here. So we're going to make that selection and delete. So a lot of the time, you know, there are easy ways to do things, but unfortunately, I couldn't find a way to quickly change the color of each one of those without manually doing this. So let's see, I'm talking and losing track here. So we just did that circle. So let's do the one next to it. So there we go. UI to invert. And we have a couple more. So we have these middle two. So boom. And select this. There. So now they're all individuals, but all still working together. And it's important to set up your effectors beforehand. That way you don't have to drag them into each cloner, although, you know, it saves you a little time, but it's not a big deal if you have to do it the other way. So there you go. They're all separate. Now to add the variation to these, I basically just duplicated. So let's just close these down so we know which ones we're affecting. And then as they're toggled open, those are the ones that have been adjusted already. So that's a good way to work. So Control drag to duplicate that. So I found, and you'll see now the benefit of changing the axis point when we rotate these. So I'm going to leave the first one at a 0 rotation, but we're going to want to rotate these just so they're moving. And let's just make sure, yeah, I just want to make sure we're adjusting the right rotation here. So I'm going to adjust these. Let's see, this one, the middle one, to be like a negative value, and then the next one after this to be a positive value. So it creates that kind of zigzag, that variation. You can already see in just this one that we've created, it adds, you know, some variation to it, a little bit more of an organic shape. So we'll do that for each. And we'll basically add the same values. You can vary it up a little bit if you want. And that will help us get an organic look. Have some variation, or you could keep it simple if you want. All depends, but I'm just doing this to really illustrate all the different possibilities, or at least the ones that I could come up with. So we're seeing that they're kind of twisting and turning. And that is a huge rotation. We just want negative 50. And we'll duplicate this. No, we don't want to change that. Although that was kind of cool. Duplicate that. Sometimes I don't like doing this tedious stuff in a tutorial, but I mean, it's just kind of the nature of it sometimes, in order to get the results you want. So I usually try to avoid that, but to get this set up, it's something that kind of had to happen. So we can see we have some twisting and turning and some variation there. So that's pretty good. And you know that you could take that as far as you want, adjust it further, do whatever you want to it to get the results that you want. But that's essentially it. You could duplicate these and add even more variation in there. But basically, now that these are adjusted and you can see their different positions, that's really what's driving the path for this. So the next, I guess, next key step in here is, so well, basically you can see that you can just control this as you wish. If we want to get rid of the X position, we can just have this move straight up. And does it have to twist like that? It doesn't. It, you know, just get rid of our rotation. And we can just have it go straight up, hit the ceiling, and then we could add back in our X position and have it move this way. So again, you know, the limitations on this are endless. You can do whatever you want with it. So right now, let's go ahead and add the delay and just kind of collapse these so it's not so chaotic. And actually, well, we do want unfold all. We do want to select our cloners, because what we're going to be doing is adding a delay effector. So if we have all those selected, that delay will automatically add itself to each one. So that's pretty handy. Now we do want the delay, as you can see here. We do want it to be at the end of our stack, because the way your stack works is basically in a hierarchical way. So from top to bottom, and the last thing we want is the delay, because we want it to affect everything. So right now, the delay is default set to blend, but we want some spring action. And if we just extend our timeline out a little bit so we can play with this thing, and we're controlling our first effector, so we can see that it has some bouncy movement. We can still see that it's, you know, it looks pretty dynamic, but it's intersecting with the floor that we're going to be putting in. So what we're going to want to do is change the fall off shape of this to a box, and we're just going to hop into our front view. And so we're basically going to be having it affect everything except for the base, those base pieces. That way, if it's excluding those things aren't going to be heading in the negative y anymore. So now let's see, we have our delay there. So if we hit play, that's the best way to preview when you have this thing going. You can see that it just hits. And I believe that is, we might have to adjust this, but it's pretty close to where our floor should be. It looks like it needs to go down just a little bit. But you can see right now it has that kind of organic feel to it. And you can just kind of play with it in real time, see if it's doing what you want it to do. And this is looking, pretty close. So what we want to do is get that basically is level with this second base over here, is level with this one as possible. So we'll just get it pretty close. So if we take our second step here, title number 1, so it's step 1. There we go. So we brought it down, and now it's basically at the same Y position. So that works out. And that's pretty sweet. So now, next thing, before we get into texturing and lighting this thing, let's go ahead and just create a basic cyc for this. I don't. There's definitely one bundled in with like the presets with Cinema 4D, but it's just as quick to go ahead and create our own. So if you haven't made your own cyc yet, here you go. There's a little tutorial on how to do that. So basically just create a simple plane, and we'll have a bend deformer, and whoops, we want that. There we go. And I believe it needs to be rotated first. Looks like we need to rotate. There we go. So let's just rotate it 90 degrees once you have it in the right direction. And we don't necessarily need a whole lot of width segments. Thought the power was tripping on me, but there we go. And let's see, we don't want to, if we decrease the X value, it will help shrink it down. It all depends on what you want it to look like, but you can kind of squash and stretch those as you please, but that's looking pretty good. So if we unsolo that, we want it to be a pretty big expanse, just so it covers everything when we're rendering. So we can just drag it out and change the height and the width. Just make it kind of a massive thing. So let's see, that looks pretty good. Let's leave it at that. I think that's CYC. Psych. All right. And actually, we'll just add quite a few subdivisions to it. Make it nice and smooth. Alrighty. So now to texture these, and after that we'll get into adding the dynamics so that we can have this thing falling from the sky, popping open, and then springing and landing like this. But I mean, right now you can already see that this is pretty great little setup. So if we want to get into texturing these, we're basically just going to go in order, and all we have to do is create our one texture, and then we can apply it to each in its own different way. So first of all, my thought in creating this was I wanted it to be really electric feeling, and I experimented around a little bit, but ended up just creating transparent objects with some reflectivity and a lot of blurry transparency to kind of give it that mysterious feel on the inside. So we're going to leave our specular on, but for our luminance, we are going to first select the color that we want. So let's start with R, or red for Roy. And we're going to work our way through the GBIV, or any other colors you want to choose. So we're going to leave our brightness there for now, although I do, yeah, we'll bring it down. We want to copy this color that we're using because we're going to have the same color for the transparency. And also, we're going to turn on some reflection. And actually, jumping back to our transparency, we're going to start to preview these in a minute. But just to add some blurriness to it, because we don't, or I don't want to necessarily see all the way through this thing. And for the reflection, we're going to add a Fresnel. And we're just going to tone this down also to about 50%. So we're going to need to get some lighting in here. And let's just get that in here so then we can start previewing and see what this is going to look like. And then we can start adjusting values accordingly. So first of all, very basic lighting setup. We're going to have a sky just to add an environment to this. And it's going to just have a luminant material applied to it. There, already applied. So we have that, and then if we go ahead and just do a quick preview of our first one, we can just do a region. So you can see you get some reflections on the top there, and you can see already the transparency, the blur in there. So it gives it almost like a candy type of feel too. It just seemed to go really well with the rainbow theme. So let's just go ahead and create the rest of our colors, and then we can start messing around with the lighting and get that that real contrasty look, like in our example. So we're going to do next in orange. Just kind of make it nice and vibrant. And we're going to copy and paste our values for the luminance into our transparency. And I believe that that's all we need to change for each. So it's a pretty quick process. The only thing was, creating those twists and turns in there, which takes a little more time. If you do not want to create various colors on each one, then you can totally eliminate that step and just keep your spline work grouped together, which will speed things up. So let's change that to a nice yellow. Copy and paste that. And a G, green. Let's see. What kind of green? Something electric. That's pretty electric. There we go. And of course, once you get these things on here and rendered, maybe you'll want to change which ones you have it applied to. So that's up to you. Blue. And then I just did a purple and a magenta. So we can do something like pretty purple. Copy that. Yep, already selected, and add that to our last one. So we'll do like a real hot color. There. So we have all of those in. Let's just take a look, quick region, see what they all look like together. And again, or not again, but these blurry reflections, or not reflections, but the blurry transparency, and also if you do add blurry reflections, that's definitely going to slow down on render time. But it, it depends on the look you're going for. I think it worked out pretty well for this, but you can see the blurry transparency taking effect. And let's add a material to our cyc. And so we're going to want this just to have a slight luminant value so that it stays, slightly illuminated without global illumination or anything, because that would, for this would be, pretty render intensive, especially if you're rendering out a little sequence. So, I came up with a pretty good look, avoiding that. So there we go. Just play with it a little bit. And let's add our light in there. So we're basically going to add just a point light, and we're going to add it way above. And if you hit F5, you can just preview all of your different views. And we're going to move it back just slightly so that this object will be backlit. There. And we do want this to cast shadows, and we're just going to have area shadows. And if we go into the details, I guess we can adjust this tab first. We want the fall off to be inverse square. And now if you're unfamiliar with the different types of fall off we have here, this one is pretty intense, and then it has a fall off. So it stays pretty strong at the center, and then has kind of a gentle fall off. But you can, if you right click, and this help menu is very, very critical, at least when I'm working. If you right click on any of these parameters, you'll see the help menu, and it will show you the various types of fall off. So that's a really great resource when you're getting into lighting, or if you have a question about anything within Cinema 4D, actually, huge help. So you can kind of preview what these will look like before you even hit render and spend time on that. So let's just start setting up our render. We're going to use a physical render for this, and we're just going to do a kind of a smaller preview size, so you don't have to sit here and watch things render. And the reason why we're doing physical is because I've found that it handles, more so than the standard, it handles blurry reflections a little bit quicker. It will render this scenario substantially quicker than the standard. And the physical has other great benefits, which we can get to in future tutorials. But just as the name suggests, it really mimics a real life camera in terms of motion blur, depth of field. What else? Vignetting, all that stuff. So something to explore later on. But right now we're just going to leave our settings at low just to get kind of a preview. And output the current frame. And we're just gonna check this thing out. So you can see right now our transparency, nice and blurred. You can see the reflection, the Fresnel, hitting the tops and bottoms, so that's pretty nice. Looks pretty electric, which is good. We do want it to be a bit brighter, so we're just going to increase the radius of this thing a little bit. So if we increase our radius right about there, and we may need to lower it down, but I think that's pretty decent. I mean, again, this is something that you can adjust to your taste. And it's looking pretty good. Let's see. Those reflections are looking a little hot, but we can tone that down a little bit. And I also think that if we adjust our specular just a little bit, narrow that down. And make it a little bit higher. That should look a little bit better here. Or at least have a thinner kind of specular highlight. And so again, this is something that you can tweak and play around with quite a bit, but generally that's the material setup for this thing. And then yes, just a general backlight. Yeah, so I think that's pretty good for the lighting and texturing setup. It's pretty straightforward, pretty simple, and we're basically just gonna duplicate or just create a new material for the base, and we can title this base, and we're gonna add this to our caps. So I basically just had something with like blurry reflections, and I did want it to be white just so it's kind of a simple and blends in with the background. And if we can just do a preview of this area. And the great thing about the blurry transparency is, once you get into the objects passing in front of one another, you can really start to see the colors show through. So this is going to calculate, but you can see the blurry reflections taking place in the base. And you also have these nice colors underneath on the floor. And so right now that light may be a little hot underneath, and you can always change the fall off. It may be that is too hot, and you just want to have a linear light with less intensity at the center. So again, something you can play around with, but I think we got it looking pretty good at this point. Let's go ahead and add some dynamics to this so we can get it falling and then animating across. So I mean, Yeah, I think we probably do need a little bit because you can see right here it kind of passes through the floor a little bit. So I think dynamics will help get that solved. So what we can do here is we want to create first add a dynamics collider body to our cyc, and then we want to add a rigid body to our cap, and let's just see right away what happens. It's not going to be pretty. Those caps are just going to fall. So we want those, let's see. Okay, let's see here. We want to change the object. Let's see. Let me just double check here. In my example, we don't want to add it to the individual. We want to add it to the whole group. So we actually want to create a group for this. And within that group, we're also going to nest our effectors because we want the effectors to follow that group. And so we'll just call this rainbow. And now if we add the dynamics tag to this whole group, we have the rigid body, and the collision shape is actually going to be another object. So what that other object is going to be is our cylinder. So now it's just going to fall. But if we move this up, all right, guys, I'm back. I had to look into the dynamics issue that was going on. For some reason, it was a relatively simple fix, but that happens quite often. Didn't want to make you suffer through it, so I took a little break and looked into it. But essentially, when you create your null, you want to first your null to group your entire rainbow in. You want to make sure that null's position is at the same position as your cylinder. So we're just going to grab your null and zero out the position, scale, and rotation, and make all of these a child of that null. Now, if you don't have your PSR key handy, it is something I use quite often. So in your customize palettes command, you PSR, search for it, and you can dock it if you find it. So there's that. So now that null should be in the correct position. And what we're going to do next is apply our rigid body tag to that to add dynamics. So that's basically going to be affecting the whole group. But actually, we don't want to apply it to that. We want to group our effectors in with everything, and then apply it to that. So that way, our effectors are traveling with the dynamics, which you'll see in a minute here. Helps keep everything together and keep our animation moving while the dynamics are taking effect. So now let's add a collider body to our cyc. And we will, if we hit play right now, we'll just fall through. Let's move this null up. Well, actually, before we do that, let's change this rigid body tag. Let's change its shape. It needs to be another object, and that other object is going to be our cylinder. So that's important because we have this whole hierarchy here with the dynamics tag applied to it, so everything within that will follow. But then the object that we really need to look at is our cylinder here. So that's the other object that we're going to be applying it to. So now if we move this whole group up and watch the dynamics take place, it's going to kind of freak out. And well, the problem there is that this cyc is a more complex shape. So if we do automatic mode dynamics, and then again we have that problem that I ran into earlier. So let's, if you made that mistake, let's redo that portion. So basically, and I just want to actually, I'll just create a whole new null, make it a child of that cylinder, 0 out the position, scale, rotation, and group everything underneath it. And we'll just call it rainbow. We'll again add our rigid body tag, and the shape will be another object, and it will be our cylinder. So now, as we move that up, we'll change our shape. And there we go. So now the automatic mode dynamics tag is applied to the cyc, which is allowing it to kind of bounce around. And so you can change your settings here, but you can see the dynamics taking effect. So one thing that we do want to do that we haven't done yet, and maybe we should have done it before, but I think we can get away with doing it now, is we want to animate this first step effector so that the rainbow is animating. And so now that we're doing it at this point, it's going to be a little harder to see it take place. But if we just bring it enough below on the Y, and then we keyframe ahead and bring the step above, just so it captures everything, then I believe it should play out. Yeah, so obviously the timing's bad, but if we drag those keyframes back, we want it to kind of pop as it hits the floor. So right about there is pretty good. And we also can adjust, obviously, the bounce. I think it's bouncing a little too much on the floor, so we can just reduce the amount on the floor. And there we go. It kind of falls, hits, and it kind of springs out and hits the ground and interacts with it dynamically. And we'll just reduce our timeline because we don't need to see exactly that much. So there we go. That follows. So the only thing left, really, I know there's a little bit of tweaking to do with lighting and texturing, which you guys can play around with and go about your own design there. But we do need to get the delay effector to take more of an effect. So I'll just scale that up a little bit so that the fall off is not going right to the edge, but we're getting more of the center of the delay all around our object. And let's also check the strength of the spring effect. So we'll just increase that quite a bit. So there we go. We have already, you can see a little bit more bounce in the organic shapes there. So hopefully that wasn't too convoluted of a setup. I know that there were a lot of variables, but we powered through it, and you get to see the flexibility and the power of setting up a rig similar to this. You can really do whatever you want with it and shrink and grow this selection as much as possible. And you could clone this object and have a whole radial array of them, which would look cool. They're just endless ideas. So you guys go ahead and play around with this and create something cool and exciting, and feel free to share it. I really appreciate you watching, and be sure to check in again next time for another Mirror Maze tutorial. Thanks.